The wind off the cliffs had a way of finding you, even behind closed doors. In the coastal town of Tregenna, most of us had grown used to the bite in the air, but nothing prepared me for the day a half-starved kitten staggered out of the fog and grabbed my hand like it was the only lifeline she had left. Her fur was matted, her ribs like wire under wet skin, and yet there was this fire in her eyes. I didn't think I needed saving, not until she showed up. I'm Daniel, and I fix things, wooden beams, rotting floorboards, leaky cottages, but I'd long stopped trying to fix people, especially myself. When I picked up that trembling scrap of life, I had no idea she'd take me back to a place I swore I'd buried for good. A place I hadn't visited since I was 9 years old, standing in the rain after they zipped up my mother's coat for the last time. The morning had started the way most do here on the Cornish coast. Low clouds pressing in like a second ceiling, the smell of sea salt and old moss seeping through the timber walls of my cottage, and gulls crying out over the slate rooftops like restless ghosts. I was repairing a split joist in the back room, my hands stiff from the chill, when Moira called through the garden gate, her voice thinned by the wind but edged with urgency. She didn't come by often, not unless it mattered. I wiped the sawdust from my hands and stepped outside, the ground damp beneath my boots, the ivy curling along the stone path like it had its own quiet intent. Moira's eyes, those pale, hawk-like things, were locked on a half-collapsed shed behind her property, and without needing to explain, she nodded toward it. "There's something in there," she said, "something small and scared." I approached cautiously, the scent of rust and damp timber growing stronger with each step. The shed's door hung off one hinge, creaking as I eased it open. At first, there was nothing, just the scattered remains of gardening tools, a deflated tire, and the familiar rot of forgotten places. Then, in the furthest corner, partially hidden beneath a torn canvas sack, I saw her. A kitten, barely bigger than my hand, soaked to the skin, shivering so hard it looked like she might simply break apart. Her eyes locked onto mine with a kind of desperate defiance I didn't expect, and before I could even crouch, she pushed herself forward on trembling legs, stumbled, then reached out with one paw and placed it on my knuckles. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't dramatic. It was raw, instinctual, the way something clings when it's got no other choice left. Her claws barely grazed me, but I felt the gesture like a spark straight to the chest. I lifted her slowly, holding her close to the thick canvas of my jacket, and for the briefest moment she melted into the warmth. Then her body tensed again, unsure whether I was sanctuary or danger. That's the part I remember most, how she couldn't decide. That doubt, that flickering distrust, it hit something inside me, a place I hadn't touched in years. Back in the cottage, I lit the fire higher than usual and wrapped her in one of the old wool blankets my mother had left behind, one of the few things I'd held onto, even when I couldn't stand to look at it. She burrowed into the fabric like she'd known it all her life, and I watched as sleep began to settle her tiny frame, though the occasional twitch of her ears betrayed the storm still raging inside. I didn't name her right away. That felt too final, too close. But as the hours passed and the fire crackled, I found myself whispering to her, small things, silly things, until the name Fig rose from my chest like it had been waiting there, caught between memory and the sound of rain on glass. The first few days with Fig were marked by a quiet rhythm, like learning a language where silence carried more meaning than sound. I made no sudden movements, kept my voice low, and let the small, feral thing chart her own path across the narrow thresholds of my home. She spent hours beneath the sofa, her eyes glinting like wet obsidian whenever I passed by. I would set down small bowls of warm broth and bits of soft shredded meat, retreating to the other side of the room while she crept out on trembling legs. Each step she took seemed laced with suspicion, as though the floorboards themselves might betray her. I recognized that kind of fear, not in the way she flinched or froze, but in how she never turned her back, not even to sleep. That constant watchfulness, that readiness to run, it was a language I'd once spoken fluently. Outside, the winter fog wrapped itself around the village like an old grudge, and the sea hissed against the cliffs with a kind of restless hunger. The world seemed distant, muffled behind the walls of the cottage, where time was measured not by clocks, but by the slow thawing of Fig's trust. There were moments, though, flickers of something else. One morning, as I mended a loose shutter by the front window, I felt a tiny weight press against my ankle. I didn't dare look down at first. I kept my hands moving, heart suddenly tight, breath caught. But when I finally glanced over my shoulder, there she was, Fig, leaning into my boot like it was a pillar she could finally lean against. No sound, no demand, just contact. And then, just as suddenly, she was gone again, disappearing under the armchair like a shadow doused in wind. Neil stopped by that afternoon, carrying a bag of cat food and a box of old towels. He didn't ask too many questions, he never did, but I saw the way his eyes lingered on the kitten-shaped silence hovering just beneath the furniture. "You really keeping her?" he asked, half joking, half not. I shrugged, unsure how to answer. Fig wasn't mine, not really. She was wild, in the way that pain can turn a living thing into something half feral. But I wasn't sure I wanted to let her go either. Neil crouched by the fireplace, watching the flames dance, and after a long pause said, "Reminds me of you, you know, back then." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. As Fig began to move more freely through the cottage, her behavior shifted in small, unpredictable ways. She'd stare at her reflection in the glass of the wood stove, ears twitching, then leap backward as if startled by some other presence only she could see. She refused to eat if I was watching, yet cried when I left the room. She'd bite the hem of my jeans, then hide from the sound of her own name. It was as if two animals lived inside her, one that wanted to belong, and one that had learned never to trust what came with warmth. And every time she looked at me with those wide, questioning eyes, I saw both of them staring back. It was during a thunderstorm that Fig fell ill. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in that slow, creeping way that whispers before it strikes. At first, it was the way she stopped responding to sounds, her ears no longer flicking toward creaks or distant door hinges. Then her appetite faded, her movements became sluggish, and by the third night, she barely lifted her head when I crouched beside her. Her small chest rose and fell with a strange, labored rhythm, and her once bright eyes dulled like rain-soaked coal. I wrapped her in the same wool blanket she had claimed as her own, and sat beside the fire long after the logs had burned down to glowing bones. The storm outside was unforgiving. Rain lashed against the windows in horizontal sheets, and the wind screamed through the trees like it was looking for something it had lost. But inside, there was only the sound of her breathing, shallow and uneven. I didn't realize I was crying until I tasted salt. I hadn't cried in years, not even when Elsie died. Not when they took me to that silent room with its floral wallpaper and sat me across from a man who didn't know how to tell a child that their world had just ended. But here I was, crouched on the floor of my own home, whispering promises into the ear of a creature that might not even understand me. The vet clinic was closed, the roads slick and winding, dangerous even in daylight. I wrapped Fig tightly in a blanket-lined basket and carried her through the village under my coat, shielding her from the wind, my boots sloshing through puddles that reached my ankles. By the time I reached Moira's, my hands were numb and the muscles in my arms burned from holding her so carefully. Moira had worked with animals all her life, barn cats, injured foxes, once even a tawny owl with a shattered wing. She took one look at Fig and her face went pale. "It's not just exposure," she murmured. "This is something deeper." She brewed a foul-smelling herbal concoction, something passed down from her mother's notebooks, and dabbed it beneath Fig's nose. "If she makes it through the night," Moira said softly, "she'll have a chance, but you need to be with her, close. She needs your scent, your warmth. She needs to believe she's safe." That word, believe, struck something inside me. It reminded me of the bedtime stories my mother used to tell, always about small creatures who survived by trusting the hands that reached for them. I carried Fig home again, laying her beside me in bed, too tired to care that my pillow soaked through with rainwater and sweat. All I could hear was her faint breathing, a tiny metronome ticking between life and the place beyond. As I drifted off, I remembered a hospital room, the beeping of monitors, and the feeling of my own small hand searching for something, someone to hold on to. Back then, no one reached back. This time I swore to be different. The morning came slow and gray, with a dull light that filtered through the linen curtains like breath through gauze. I hadn't slept, not really. I lay there beside her, half awake, listening to the faint flutter of her breathing. Each inhale a question, each exhale a quiet refusal to surrender. When she stirred, just barely, a twitch of a paw, the smallest shifting of her weight toward the warmth of my chest, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Her body was still too warm, her eyes still dulled by fever, but there was something in her movement that spoke of resistance, a fragile insistence that she was not ready to let go. I spent the day in silence. I didn't pick up my tools. I didn't answer the phone when Neil called. I just moved through the house like a ghost in a place he built but no longer belonged to. Fig slept tucked beneath my sweater most of the day, a barely there weight against my ribs, as if she were borrowing breath from me until her own lungs remembered how to fight. At one point, I caught myself humming, an old tune from somewhere buried in childhood, a lullaby my mother used to hum while folding laundry. I hadn't heard it in years, hadn't even realized it still lived in some dusty corner of my mind. And yet there it was, summoned not by thought, but by need. Neil showed up just before sunset, his truck kicking up gravel as he parked by the gate. He didn't knock, just opened the door and stepped in like he used to before things got complicated. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Fig nestled in the crook of my arm, her ears twitching, but her body too tired to flee. He sat without a word, the firelight flickering across his weathered face. "You look like shit," he said finally. I let out a tired laugh, one that felt dry and unfamiliar. "She made it through the night," I said, as if saying it aloud would make it more true. Neil leaned forward, elbows on knees. "And what if she doesn't make it through the next?" I didn't answer. Not right away. I knew what he meant. It wasn't just about the kitten, it was about me, how much I'd let her in, how quickly I'd built something fragile and rooted in a place I never let anything grow. "I don't know," I finally said, "but I think I'd rather have her for a few days and feel something real than go back to feeling nothing at all." He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding. That was the thing about Neil. He didn't push. He just witnessed, which sometimes was enough. That night, Fig stood on her own for the first time in days. Only for a few seconds, her legs shaking beneath her like saplings in wind, but she stood. And I realized then, this wasn't just about saving a life. It was about choosing to be present, to bear witness to another creature's pain without running from your own. And for the first time in years, I was willing to stay. The days that followed brought a cautious kind of hope, the kind you don't speak out loud in case it vanishes. Fig was eating again, not much but enough to mark the distance between survival and surrender. She still moved like a creature born in shadows, skittish and sharp-eyed, but there were new patterns emerging. She slept in the window seat during the day, curled like a comma between the worn spines of old books. At night, she settled closer to where I slept, not touching, but near enough that the space between us felt warm with possibility. I started leaving the workshop door open while I worked, letting the smell of wood shavings and turpentine drift into the house. Sometimes I'd look up and catch her watching from the threshold, eyes blinking slow as if trying to read who I was when I wasn't watching. But peace has a way of drawing attention in small towns, and it wasn't long before the outside world began to knock. Moira had mentioned the kitten in passing to the woman who ran the animal welfare group 2 villages over, a well-meaning gesture, but one that set a chain of scrutiny into motion. On a Thursday afternoon, a white van rolled into the driveway, bearing the logo of a local shelter, its sides plastered with bright slogans and silhouettes of purring cats. A woman named Hazel stepped out, young, efficient, polite, in a way that felt like protocol rather than warmth. She wore rubber-soled shoes and a clipboard, and she smiled too quickly when she spoke. "We heard you've taken in an abandoned kitten. We'd love to help. Vaccines, foster placement, adoption opportunities. We can have her rehomed by next week." The words hit like a stone through glass. I stood in the doorway, Fig tucked behind my leg, watching with narrowed eyes. Hazel peered past me, her eyes scanning the cottage like she was assessing not just the space but me, as if trying to calculate whether I was fit to care for anything fragile. "We have protocols," she added, smiling again, "to make sure cats get the best care possible." It wasn't aggressive, but it was final, neat. processed, and I hated how tidy it sounded, how quick the world was to categorize something wild and wounded as just another case to be handled. That night, I sat with Neil on the back steps, the cold creeping in beneath our coats. "They're not wrong," he said. "They're just not you." He took a sip from the flask he always kept in his jacket, then passed it my way. "Question is, are you keeping her because she needs saving or because you do?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I looked through the window, saw Fig curled on the blanket, her body finally still, and I felt the weight of a decision pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just about a cat anymore. It was about what happens when something broken finds something else broken, and they begin quietly to hold each other together. It's strange how quickly something or someone can become part of your daily ritual without asking permission. By the second week, Fig had etched herself into the quiet architecture of my life. She waited for me by the door when I brought in firewood. She'd curl inside the hood of my jacket while I read by the hearth. Even her silences had become familiar, like background music I didn't notice until it stopped. And yet, with every day she got stronger, something inside me grew heavier, as if healing her came with the cost of exposing an old wound in myself that had never properly closed. Moira came by with a bag of supplies and a look in her eye that told me she'd heard about the shelter visit. She sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of nettle tea, her gaze fixed on the sleeping kitten curled against my sweater. "She's mending," she said softly, almost reluctantly, "which means you'll have a decision to make soon." I didn't reply. I just watched Fig's flank rise and fall, small and rhythmic, a pulse I'd memorized more than I cared to admit. "You know she might thrive with a family, right?" Moira continued. "Someplace with children, a garden, someone around all day. You work with your hands. You can't always be here." The words weren't cruel, just practical. That made them harder to argue with. Later that evening, I found myself in the workshop, sanding down the edge of an old cedar shelf, not because it needed it, but because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. Fig sat in the doorway, watching with that unreadable gaze that cats wear so well. "What do I do with you?" I asked aloud. She blinked, slow and steady, and I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it hurt in a way I hadn't expected. I never meant to get attached. I told myself I was just giving her a chance, but the truth was she was giving me one too. The dilemma wasn't just about her future, it was about mine. To keep her would mean reshaping my life around something unpredictable, something fragile. It meant being needed again, in a way that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I'd built my life around solitude, around things that didn't depend on me emotionally. Wood bends or breaks, tools do what they're told. But this was something else. Something alive. Something that could leave. And yet the thought of her sleeping somewhere else, in a stranger's home, staring at a different window, felt unbearable. Not because I didn't trust other people, but because I couldn't shake the idea that we weren't finished, that there was more healing to be done. For her, yes, but also for me. Maybe I wasn't afraid of the responsibility. Maybe I was afraid of what it meant to admit that I wanted to be chosen, and for once, to stay. It was the absence that struck me first. The sudden silence in the morning, that strange, hollow quiet where a familiar sound used to live. I had become so used to Fig's tiny footsteps, the rustle of her claws on the floorboards, the gentle thump of her landing on the windowsill before sunrise, that when I stepped into the living room and heard nothing at all, it felt like the breath had been knocked from the house itself. I called her name, not loud, not sharp, but with a lilt of concern that rose into the ceiling beams and returned unanswered. The blanket she usually claimed as her throne lay untouched, its folds undisturbed. The fire had burned out during the night, and the chill had crept back in like a thief through the cracks. Panic came on slow, then all at once. I checked every corner, beneath the sofa, behind the bookcase, in the hollow beneath the stairs where she sometimes curled. Nothing. I opened every door, even the old root cellar I rarely used, my heart pounding in a rhythm I hadn't felt since I was a boy, searching the woods for a dog that never came home. I stepped outside barefoot, not caring about the frost beneath my feet, and called her again into the thick gray dawn. The sky was still holding its breath, and the village below was wrapped in fog so dense it erased the sea cliffs from view. That's when I saw the prints. Small, uneven, but unmistakably hers, leading from the garden gate toward the woods that bordered the southern edge of the property. My stomach twisted. She had never gone that far before. I threw on boots, grabbed my coat, and followed the trail through wet leaves and the cold hush of pine needles. The forest here isn't deep, but it has a way of making you feel swallowed, like the trees know you're trespassing. Branches clawed at my jacket as I pushed through, heart thudding, thoughts racing with images of foxes, traps, the silent things that hide between roots and stone. I found her near the old quarry, curled in the hollow of a fallen log. She wasn't injured, but her body was tight, alert, as if she'd come here deliberately. Her eyes locked on mine, not with fear, but with something older. Like she'd come to this place not by accident, but because she remembered it somehow, even though she'd never been here before. I crouched beside her, reached out, and she didn't move. She didn't flee, but she didn't come either. And that unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. When I finally coaxed her into my arms, she didn't protest, but she didn't melt into me like she once had. She stared back at the woods, her ears flicking at something I couldn't hear. As we walked home, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was drifting, not from health, not from fear, but from me. And that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one in this house haunted by something long buried, something calling her away. The days after Fig's disappearance were different. Not in any loud or visible way, but in the atmosphere. Like something had shifted in the cottage, in the rhythm of our coexistence. She was safe, yes, but she was more distant. She still followed me from room to room, still curled into the crook of my knee when I sat by the fire, but her gaze was somewhere else now, as though some invisible thread was pulling her toward a place I couldn't reach. It reminded me of the look my mother used to get in the final months, sitting at the edge of her hospital bed with her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if trying to remember something far away. I'd sit beside her and talk about school, about the fog, about the cat that used to sleep on the porch, and she'd nod, smile even, but I knew she wasn't really with me anymore. And somehow, I saw the same haunting quiet in Fig's stare. I kept working, though my focus was splintered. My hands remembered how to shape wood even when my mind drifted. A bookshelf for Moira, a table repair for the village chapel. But between hammer blows and sanding strokes, I'd catch myself pausing, looking toward the door, half expecting her to vanish again. Neil stopped by one evening, bringing a tin of sardines and a worn copy of a cat behavior guide he picked up from a charity shop. He watched Fig from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed. "You ever think," he said, "maybe she's not meant to stay?" I didn't look up. "And maybe I'm not meant to let her go." He didn't argue. He just leaned against the counter and stayed a while, which, for Neil, was its own form of concern. Moira, ever practical, had begun dropping hints about adoption again. She even mentioned a family in Penwith. Nice people, she said, garden space, 2 children, a gentle spaniel. Fig could have a good life there, she told me one afternoon, her tone soft but purposeful. Maybe even a fuller one. I nodded, but my jaw had already tightened. Because she wasn't wrong. But she also didn't know the whole shape of it. How that kitten's presence had begun pulling threads loose in me I didn't even realize were tangled. How her small, stubborn survival had created a mirror I couldn't ignore. One night, Fig did something she hadn't done before. As I lay on the sofa beneath the same blanket that had once swaddled her when she was weak and shaking, she climbed onto my chest, placed her paws softly over my heart, and rested her chin just beneath my collarbone. It was a heavy kind of stillness, not just of comfort, but of choice. She stayed there long past sleep, and I didn't dare move. I just stared at the ceiling, feeling the faint weight of her breath against my skin, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe I wasn't entirely alone in the world. But even as I lay there, I knew it wasn't over. There was something unresolved between us, a question neither of us could ask out loud. Would I be enough for her? Would she be enough for me? Or were we two wounded things, helping each other stand just long enough to walk away? It was the call that broke the silence. Moira again, her voice low and hesitant, as though even she wasn't certain she should be saying what she was saying. The Penwith family, they're coming through the village this weekend. They asked if they could meet her. The words hovered in the air long after the call ended, echoing in the beams of the ceiling, in the whistle of the wind pressing against the window panes. I stood in the center of the kitchen, staring at the place where Fig usually sat, by the stove, curled beside the copper kettle, and felt the stillness settle in like dust. It wasn't just a visit. It was the beginning of a decision I wasn't ready to make, a decision I'd been dancing around since the moment she laid her tiny paw on my hand and rewired something deep in my bones. I told myself I had a few days, that maybe they wouldn't come, that maybe Fig would show some sign, some unmistakable sign, that she was meant to stay or meant to go. But cats don't give you certainty. They give you glances, gestures, moments that feel monumental and then vanish like steam from a teacup. That week, I watched her more closely than I ever had. Every twitch of her ear, every time she paused in the hallway, gazing out the window at something I couldn't see. She seemed neither content nor restless, just present, balanced on a wire between comfort and some far-off calling. And it killed me not knowing what side she'd fall toward. The night before the family's visit, I sat on the edge of the bed with her beside me, brushing my hand gently along her spine. She didn't purr. She didn't flinch. She just looked at me with eyes that seemed impossibly old for a creature her size. "You're not mine," I whispered, the words catching somewhere between truth and defiance. "But I think I'm yours." Outside, the sea wind howled through the chimney, and I felt something shift inside me, a tightening, a clarity, like the first sign of a crack in thick ice. Maybe this wasn't about possession. Maybe it never had been. Maybe it was about stewardship. About loving something enough to let it go, if that's what it needed. But how do you know what something wild really needs? How do you trust yourself to make that call? The next morning, Neil showed up unannounced. He stood in the doorway, looking at me the way he had years ago when he found me sitting alone in the school hallway, fists clenched around a note I couldn't read. "You look like someone who's about to lose something," he said, no trace of humor. "But maybe you're about to give her something, too." He walked inside and sat beside Fig, who sniffed his boot, then patted away as if she had better things to do. I looked down at her small, retreating shape, so fierce, so delicate, and realized I couldn't stall the moment any longer. Whatever happened next would be a choice, and either way, someone was going to hurt. Saturday arrived under a pale, trembling sky, the kind that never quite brightens but holds a soft glow, like a lantern behind thin paper. The Penwiths were due by noon. I had told Moira they could come, not because I was sure, but because pretending I had no choice felt easier than admitting I might be wrong. I moved through the house like someone packing invisible bags, brushing off surfaces, folding Fig's blanket without knowing why, glancing at the clock every 10 minutes as if time itself would grant me a verdict. Fig trailed me, curious but detached, her tail flicking lazily as she climbed up onto the windowsill and peered through the glass toward the lane below. I watched her for a long time and wondered if she understood, if she knew today meant goodbye, or if, in her world, this was just another day like the one before. When the knock came, it was soft but unmistakable. I opened the door to find a woman in her 40s, warm-eyed and dressed like she had been preparing for something important but didn't want to overdo it. Behind her stood her husband, tall, polite, and holding a small bundle of wool, a toy mouse it turned out. And just beyond his legs, 2 children, 1 boy and 1 girl, both clutching paper drawings of cats. They smiled, and I smiled back because it felt like the right thing to do, though my jaw ached from the effort. "We're the Penwiths," she said, and I stepped aside to let them in, already feeling like an intruder in my own home. Fig didn't bolt. She didn't hide. She stayed exactly where she was, perched in the window, eyes fixed on the newcomers like they were puzzle pieces she hadn't yet decided whether to keep or cast aside. The girl, Emily, approached slowly, crouching a few feet away and holding out the toy mouse. Fig sniffed it, pawed at it gently, then turned and leapt down, brushing past my ankle as she padded toward the kitchen. The girl looked up, hopeful. "She's soft," she said, "and small." I nodded, but the lump in my throat made it hard to speak. They stayed for nearly an hour. The father asked about Fig's habits, her health, her story. The mother listened intently, nodding as I spoke, occasionally glancing at her children like she was picturing a future in which the kitten curled up on their sunlit rug or chased bugs in the garden. At one point, she gently placed her hand on my arm and said, "You've done something good here. You gave her a second chance." I wanted to respond, but I couldn't because it wasn't just her I'd saved, and that part didn't fit neatly into their version of events. As they prepared to leave, the mother asked, "Would it be all right if we took her next week? Gave you time?" I nodded again. It was all I could do. Fig sat near the fireplace, eyes half-lidded, tail curled neatly around her feet like a question mark at the end of a long sentence. She didn't follow them to the door. She just watched me, not them, me. And I realized, right then, that this decision, this moment, would live with me, no matter what I chose. There would be no clean end, only the weight of what I gave up or what I asked her to give. The house felt heavier after they left. The air itself seemed to settle lower, thick with what hadn't been said. I sat in the chair by the fire, the one that creaked when I leaned too far back, and stared at the place Fig had been sitting just an hour earlier. She was gone now, still inside, but absent from sight. I didn't call for her. I let the silence build, let it crawl into my ears like fog pressing into every crack. The Penwiths were kind, thoughtful, eager to love something delicate. And maybe, in another version of the world, that would have been enough. But kindness doesn't erase history. It doesn't mend the parts of you that never broke cleanly. Fig wasn't just a kitten who needed a home. She was the first living thing in years that I'd let close enough to see the broken architecture inside me. And now I was being asked to hand her over like she was a parcel that had served its purpose. The rational part of me said she'd be happy, fed, adored, safe. But another voice, the quiet, familiar one that I'd long ago buried, whispered that I wasn't done yet, that we weren't done. I found her under the bench near the kitchen window, her body curled tight, her ears flicking at the distant clink of dishes. I crouched beside her, not touching, just watching. Her eyes met mine, steady, expectant, and somehow not surprised. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the cold tile pressing into my legs, and spoke softly. Not in words meant for a cat, but for something deeper, something listening beyond language. "I don't know what the right choice is," I said, "but I know how it feels to be passed around, to be told you'll be better off somewhere else, to be spoken for without being asked." My voice cracked, and I felt the weight of childhood again, of caseworkers with clipboards, of foster homes with spare rooms and rules but no warmth. Fig crawled forward, slow and deliberate, then stepped onto my lap. She didn't curl into me. She didn't purr. She just lay there, chest against chest, looking up with those eyes that never blinked first. And I felt it. Not affection, not dependency, but something harder to name. Recognition. A knowing that this thing between us was more than comfort. It was survival by proximity. It was the way two lost things find gravity in each other and refuse to drift apart. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake with Fig pressed into my ribs, her breath warm against the skin above my heart. I stared at the ceiling and saw the lines of a life I hadn't planned for, but now couldn't imagine walking away from. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, the decision stopped being a question. It became a truth. But even truths carry consequences, and morning would bring them to my door. The morning light spilled across the wooden floorboards like a slow confession. It was pale and yellowed, slipping through the salt-streaked windows as if unsure it had permission to enter. I sat by the fire, fully dressed though I hadn't slept, with Fig tucked inside the fold of my coat, her head resting just beneath my chin, the tip of one paw caught in the seam of my collar like an anchor. I'd spent the last few hours replaying every moment, her trembling frame on the floor of that broken shed, the first time she blinked back instead of bolting, the day she disappeared into the woods as if summoned by ghosts. But more than anything, I kept hearing the quiet rhythm of her breath, how it had changed from erratic to steady, from survival to sleep. The Penwiths were due back by 10. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel first, followed by muted voices and the creak of the garden gate swinging wide. I stood slowly, not because I wanted to greet them, but because avoiding them would have felt like cowardice. And I owed this moment, not just to them, but to myself and to Fig. I opened the door and stepped outside, the wind catching the edge of my coat, and there they were. The mother, holding a carrier lined with blankets. The father standing with both hands clasped as though in prayer. The children, each with a small packet of treats clutched in tiny fingers. They looked up at me with soft eyes, eyes that didn't push, but waited. "She's ready?" the woman asked gently. And it should have been so simple to say yes. I should have smiled and handed her over and thanked them for caring. I should have been grateful for the opportunity to give Fig a stable, loving home. But as I looked down, I realized I was still holding her, not just in my arms, but in a way that felt cellular, like she'd stitched herself to the fault lines in me, and maybe I'd stitched myself to hers. She lifted her head and blinked at the sound of the woman's voice, but she didn't shift away. She stayed still, watching, waiting, like she already knew I'd made my choice long before they arrived. "I appreciate everything," I said slowly, the words thick with something old. "Truly, you seem like a wonderful family." I paused, tightened my arms around the small warmth against my chest. "But she's not leaving." The silence that followed was gentle, but final. The mother nodded, her expression soft with understanding rather than disappointment. "You saved her," she said. "That's never easy to let go of." I nodded back, and she reached out, touched my arm once, not to persuade, not to challenge, but simply to acknowledge the weight of it all. Then they turned and left, their steps quiet along the gravel path. Inside, the house was still. I sat back down, pulled Fig closer, and exhaled for the first time in hours. She looked up at me, blinked once, and then, for the first time, pressed her forehead against mine. We hadn't just found each other. We had chosen to stay. Time moved differently after that morning, not faster, not slower, just more honestly. There was no longer a question hanging between us. No more glances toward the door, no more hesitation when I reached out. Fig belonged here, not because I kept her, but because she stayed. The house took on a different shape after that, like it had stretched to make room for something it hadn't known it needed. I started leaving the door open during warm afternoons, not in fear of her wandering, but in quiet trust that she'd return. And she always did, bounding across the flagstones, trailing leaves or dirt, or some invisible story in her whiskers, only to curl up on my lap like she'd never been gone at all. Moira stopped by with new toys and a bag of fresh litter, a kind of quiet apology folded into the gesture. She didn't bring up the Penwiths. She didn't need to. She just watched Fig curl into a sunbeam near the window and said, "She's heavier now, solid." I nodded, understanding the weight she meant. Not just in body, but in presence, in consequence. Fig had become part of the foundation, woven into the way I moved, the way I thought, even the way I slept. No longer just a rescue, now a companion. Neil, true to form, didn't say much when he came by next. He just handed me a mug of too-strong coffee and grunted, "So it's settled then." I nodded. He scratched behind Fig's ear and added, "Good, you both needed something that won't walk away." It was a rare moment of vulnerability, wrapped in gruffness, but I felt the truth of it. I hadn't just made room for her, I'd made room for something in myself I thought was long gone. Care, hope, the terrifying promise of continuity. And Fig, she's still Fig. She still disappears for hours into cabinets I swear I closed, still watches birds like she's waiting for them to mess up. She still bites my fingers when I forget to warm the food first. But now she purrs. And sometimes she sleeps so deeply beside me that I catch myself reaching out just to make sure she's still breathing. And every time I feel her chest rise, I'm reminded that we're still in this, both of us. Learning, failing, choosing again, day by day. This wasn't the story I expected to tell. I didn't go looking for a cat. I didn't think I needed saving. But when Fig reached out from the shadows and placed her tiny paw on my hand, she pulled me out of something darker than I was willing to admit. And in saving her, I found a way back to myself. Not the boy I used to be, but the man who finally understood what it means to stay. So if you've ever felt the weight of being unchosen, if you've ever watched something fragile walk into your life and ask, without words, listen, let it in. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find your way home again. If this story touched something in you, subscribe, stick around. There's more to share, because Fig's story isn't over, and neither is mine. Some stories don't end, they just become part of who we are. If this story stayed with you, Let it keep walking beside you. Like, subscribe, share it with someone who needs it. More stories, more healing, more reasons to stay.